So already in the 21st century, now we have had terrorist attacks, financial crashes, authoritarian governments, tsunamis, volcanoes, the rise of artificial intelligence, and now a global pandemic. While these events have surprised many leaders, almost all have been forecast in advance by futurists, scientists, and some governmental officials. There are no facts about the future because there are too many factors in the world that could change in any moment to derail even the most confident forecast. Let's think, for example, that maybe in January 2011, a urban planner in Fukushima could have forecast with a high degrees of certainty the number of people that would need public transportation within the following years. But suddenly, in March, that same year, the tsunami hits. And there was little of the city left to forecast about. And we are seeing more or less the same today with the pandemic. A virus can arise that target population over a certain age, and this changed completely the world population. So the exogenous factor always exists to envision the future. But foresight is a process to consider future possible scenarios. So to start with the conversation, I would like to ask to our panelists, why is foresight so important right now? So Clarissa, could you start trying to give us with an idea of this? Why is foresight important right now?
Yes, and since you are also using stories, I would like to ask everyone in the audience, can you remember the day when you saw a mobile phone for the first time? So I remember I was walking on the street and there was this person having like a very big, like sort of brick talking on the phone. And I was like completely marveled. And I was like, wow, like the closest thing to that was like the phones that were in the cars and you know, in those times. So remember that moment. And then remember if in that moment you imagine that you will be using that brick for sending an email. I guess that you did not think about it because we didn't know what emails were by then, or like how we can use a phone like to do these kind of things, right? And that's exactly why we need foresight, because we need to try to anticipate the future in order to take decisions now that are going to be good, let's say, decisions that are going to help us to, in my case, in my field of work, manage future global risks. So that's why I think it's really good that if we cannot forecast it, so you may have heard that term forecast, which is based on predictions, based on facts. So if we cannot do that for this type of, for example, in my case, again, new technologies, at least we can try to think about the future using a tool as foresight.
Yeah, that's great, Clarita. Thank you. What about you, Marcus?
I think we always feel the need in a way to navigate a little bit the uncertainties of the future. So we want to know a little bit more, you know, how the future will look like, you know, and also maybe to steer it into the right direction. And especially in a time when the world is faced with really fundamental challenges and threats, I think foresight in this context is even more important. I mean, think about climate change, but also many other developments. So I would say we always need to explore in a way the alternatives we have in the future in a structured way. And that's what foresight is all about for me.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And Vanessa?
Yeah, I would just like to add that the world is very complex. We're a globalized world now. And there are all kinds of actions that will have consequences, not just for ourselves, but also for others who are far away, removed from us in great distances in space, but even time. When we're thinking about problems like climate change, this is an intergenerational problem. So this is why foresight is especially important. We really do have to think deliberately about the future and what the consequences of our present day actions or inactions will be.
Yeah, that's right. It seems like a very strategic point of view. And Ignacio, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I fully agree with everything that has been said. It helps us prepare to the uncertainty that will happen, but it also can help us imagine the type of future we want to live in, which policies we want to have, how do we want to relate with other people and with nature or with technology. And we really need a human imagination to think on those futures, because as it says, if you don't know where you're gonna go, you probably will get lost. So it's important that we envision these kind of futures that we want to achieve.
Yeah, thank you, Ignacio. That's right. Okay, so I think that we more or less agree. More or less, no, we agree that foresight is particularly now is an important topic on discipline to consider. But I would like to understand better how this discipline is developed. I mean, could you tell us in an easy way what methods are usually used during foresight exercise or foresight analysis? Maybe Vanessa, could you start?
So when I was reflecting on this question, future studies is a very heterogeneous field. There are all kinds of approaches. Some people are highly quantitative, others are more qualitative, but what all of the people who do future studies have in common is that they are trying to exercise disciplined speculation. So Felix mentioned that there are no facts about the future. So we are engaging in a speculative exercise, but what I would say all future studies people have in common is they are trying to direct these imaginative skills, or they're trying to direct a simulation model to try to inform us about possible futures and what sorts of strategies we should be implementing now.
Wow, this of the discipline speculation. Wow, that seems it's impacting to me. Okay, great. Thank you, Vanessa. And what about you, Marcus?
I mean, I would directly follow up on what Vanessa said. That yes. I mean, the interesting thing about foresight is, in a way, it's still much about speculation. You know, we try to give it maybe sometimes also more than it deserves the touch of being extremely rational, because in the end we know there's many unknown facts about the future. I mean, we already have often difficulties to come up with very clear answers, you know, evidence-based answers for the present. So it's all the more difficult for the future. And in terms of the methods, therefore, I mean, it's not surprising that there are many methods out there, you know, some, as Vanessa already said, more focused on quantitative aspects, other on more qualitative aspects. But I think what they share is, in a way, that they try to anticipate trends, risks, emerging issues, but also the potential implications of certain policy decisions. So in my particular case, I'm most familiar really like with scenario creation, in the sense of, on the basis of existing evidence, you come up with different scenarios, you try to define certain intervening factors and how would that change in a way the future in a certain policy area. But there are many other ways and approaches out there how you can go about foresight and strategic foresight in particular.
Great, Marcus. And from your point of view, Clarissa, what methods are usually used during foresight exercise?
Yeah, I can mention horizon scanning using Delphi technique was the first activity that I was part of. I was a participant and it was led by my colleague at the center. And basically what we did was to use the topic of bioengineering and how different aspects of bioengineering are going to be important for academia, society, and policy in 5, 10, and 15 years. And the process was to have an expert elicitation. So he conveyed a group of experts on different fields. And then we had a list of like 100 different topics. And then after subsequent sessions, we were shorting them into 80, into 50, and putting priorities and what are the topics that are going to be more important. And at the end, when we had like a list of like, I think there was 20 topics, we come up together and then we sit down and start talking about each of them. And then we come up with a list of 10. And those are the ones that we made in the publication. So that will be horizon scanning and Delphi. The other technique that we have been using, for example, with the Global Future Council on Frontier Risk was the creation of future scenarios. And we created like a set of, I think was around 7 or 8 future scenarios. And we incorporated them as part of the Global Risk Report that the World Economic Forum published in January 2021. And this was with the idea to just try to get the attention of people to think about how the future that we want or we don't want can look like. And I think that the third thing that I did with the Geneva Center for Security Policy was in relation to COVID. And we use a technique called the future wheels. And basically you put a topic in the middle and then you start putting branches out of them. And then from that branch creates another branch, and then you start seeing what are the connections between all those branches.
Wow, that would be interesting, this future wheel. And Ignacio, I would like to know from your experience, what methods are usually do you use for your foresight exercise? And how do you apply it to your work?
Yeah, I have applied the participatory scenario planning method as you described before, which is a method that allows engaging different stakeholder typologies to resolve and discuss common issues, but also recently modeling approaches at different scales. And one we did, which was particularly interesting, is to understand the synergies and the trade-offs among different sustainable development goals, because we have different targets that we want to achieve, and we can implement different actions towards them. So what we did is to model how we could distribute funds, or how funds could be distributed from the RED Plus program, which is one of the largest programs to reduce deforestation and forest degradation globally, and how the distribution of funds could impact biodiversity conservation, climate change mitigation, but also social equity. And this kind of deeply interdisciplinary quantitative modeling in scenarios it's a type of work that I think it's going to be needed in the next years to respond to some research and policy challenges.
Yeah, I agree with you. Great, Ignacio, thank you. Vanessa, you have said that you work with climate change. Could you develop a little bit more? How do you apply foresight in your work related to climate change?
Yeah, so specifically on the topic of climate change, because I mentioned it's an intergenerational problem. We know that the committed levels of climate change that we're observing now, some of that is due to present day emissions, but a lot of it is due to historical emissions. So this notion of making sure that you're considering the long-term impacts of our socioeconomic systems, our energy systems, our food systems, how do we use land? That's where I happen to use a particular technique that is semi-qualitative and semi-quantitative. When Felix introduced me, he mentioned this cross-impact balances technique. And what's nice about that technique is that you can look at these different scenario factors and you can consider them to be nodes in a network, and you can try to systematically record how are these nodes related to each other, and sort of have these schematics of these interrelationships and then simulate them forward to understand if you toggle particular outcomes, like having highly energy efficient energy systems versus what's sort of the mix of renewables versus fossil fuel technologies. You try to sort of understand a very heterogeneous set of things that are influencing each other. So both technological specifications and social specifications. And so in my particular work, this kind of semi-qualitative technique is especially useful if you're talking about very novel technologies. Now, with respect to climate change, we're sort of looking forward to how decreasing our emissions, we haven't done this fast enough. So people are starting to also consider other experimental technologies that deliberately remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And those are so new that's why having something that's like a semi-qualitative technique like this can be useful. But when it comes to how might these scenarios maybe try to improve climate change governance, something that I have observed, because I'm also in a department of interdisciplinary knowledge integration, and the climate change problem, for those of you who follow it, maybe you've read in IPCC reports that there's this big mix of a lot of quantitative scientific data, but there's also a lot of discussion about the challenges of how do we adapt to climate change and how do we properly govern the climate change problem. And there are a lot of non-scientific concerns, basically questions about values. What kind of humans do we want to be while we're trying to manage this crisis? And often when people are taking a purely quantitative approach to thinking about the future, people will sometimes be surprised by the variety of values perspectives. We sort of have seen this already a little bit in COVID, how those of us who are trained as scientists, we might feel like it's very straightforward. We build the epidemiological models and then we design public policy accordingly. But there are people who are resisting wearing masks, who are resisting getting vaccinated. And that is where there are other non-scientific issues that are also at play. And so, Felix, I'm not sure if this is a satisfactory answer, but some of the things that we see in terms of like trying to govern COVID, and then if we try to think about a longer term problem, like how to govern climate change, I think we're all still figuring out how is it that we engage the people who are perhaps skeptical about what the science is telling us. And I do think that probably the way forward is through these participatory exercises, where we make sure that we respect and honor the influence of non-scientific concerns in the policymaking and governance process.
Wow, that's fascinating. Absolutely, the social dimension of the future. I take this question of what kind of humans we want to be under these global challenges. And from the regional point of view, I'm curious, Marcus. I mean, Europe is a heterogeneous region, no? Politically and culturally. How do you assist foresight studies that will inform policymakers about regional policies in culture and education? And what kind of challenges have you faced? Marcus, if you could develop your perspective on this, please.
Yeah, sure, by all means. I mean, I should perhaps say that what has happened in the last couple of years is maybe a paradigmatic shift in terms of EU policy making, in the sense that there is the attempt to streamline strategic foresight into all policy making and into all policy areas. In other words, the idea is nowadays for all new legislative proposals to be accompanied not just by impact assessments in the sense of what will be the consequences of a certain legislative act, but indeed also by foresight, by a foresight perspective, in the sense of what are the alternatives and why are we opting for this one and not another one. So in that sense, this has really boosted a little bit, or maybe say this is like, I should say, even really more than that, made foresight a really crucial element of European policy-making processes. And there is even a specific system, it's called European Strategy and Policy Analysis System. It's called ESPAS, in which all EU institutions are collaborating with member states, but also think tanks and academia, to have also a foresight network in order to make sure also that you really exchange on best practices, but also that the foresight exercise is not too much steered from the beginning, because the problem is obviously when one particular body is doing foresight, sometimes they already know what the best option is, you know, before you even have the options on the table. So by having a connected system of different partners, you also want to make sure that the foresight exercise is really as trustworthy as possible, and maybe also as objective as one can be in a context of where we still are doing speculation as well. Having said that, now what does it mean concretely in the area of culture and education studies? There too, obviously, foresight plays an important role, especially since by definition, education is a policy area where decisions, you know, that the impacts might only be felt in a very long, you know, distance from now, in the sense of when you change curricula, when you change teacher training, you might only feel the effects maybe in one generation, you know, of a policy change. So in other words, in education policies, foresight is maybe even more important than in some other areas where, you know, you might see a change in policy immediately, in the sense of when you increase pensions or whatever, at least you know you have some immediate effects. At least there might also be long-term implications, obviously, but in education it's the other way around, that, you know, most of the repercussions are felt in the long term. So in other words, foresight is very important there. Cultural policies, it's applied a little bit less. Also, since culture might by definition always be seen as something, you know, which, yeah, how to put it, which is there, you know, which is as a policy area anyway, usually a bit problematic, because everyone likes it and appreciates it, but no one wants to pay for it. So in terms of policy making, that's anyway a different story in terms of when it comes to support culture and so on. So what are now the key challenges in the European context? And Felix, you have already referred to it. The European Union and Europe as a whole is a very complex entity and very heterogeneous, especially when it comes to education. So one problem there is indeed to try to find common policies where everyone would agree, because you have fundamentally different views, you know, starting from how long should pupils stay, you know, in the same class? Should you separate, you know, high performers and low performers early or later in the process? Is higher education really the solution, or should you rather go for apprenticeships and things like that? So one key problem is really to find solutions that are accepted by all member states. Another problem is simply that the EU has relatively little competencies when it comes to influencing curricula or teacher training in member states. So even when you have a great plan and everyone would subscribe to it, it doesn't mean that it would be implemented in the end, because that's usually left with member states. And maybe a third complication is that maybe even more than in other areas, there is a strong subjective component in education. So what should education do? So it's harder maybe to quantify what is good or bad, because whether you want to put a stronger emphasis on classical education in terms of, do you want to learn Greek and Latin? You know, it's hard to quantify what's the added value of that. And that makes it also hard in terms of at least quantitative work on foresight in this area. I mean, just to give you some ideas of the problems, but maybe also the interesting factors about working with education policies in the EU from a foresight perspective.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Marcus. That's a very good insight of the kind of complex work and the complex environment that you work with. And Ignacio, well, biodiversity loss is accelerating. I mean, this is a fact. Actually, this time is considered as the start of the sixth mass extinction. In your experience with the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, could you tell us shortly how the IPBES is modeling future scenario on this regard?
Yes, IPBES is the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is a platform that integrates governments and scientists and other typologies of stakeholders to provide the best knowledge on different problems or challenges that we faced. And regarding Foresight, there is a task force on scenarios and models that produced a report 5 years ago. And this task force continues trying to provide the best available information on these aspects. And one interesting thing that has been happening in the last years is that we have found that we have relatively good models to predict CO2 emissions or other changes in pollution or human population, and the impacts that these things will have on biodiversity or on ecosystem services. But we were not so well at assessing how other non-tangible aspects will change, such as values or informal institutions. And so now one of the things being done by the IPBES Task Force is to work on the Nature Futures framework that tries to understand how a society could change towards positive futures, and how values and norms and human-nature interactions could play a role into that. I think one of the interesting things on Foresight in general is that Foresight is not only a lens to look towards the future, but it's also a space for discussion. And I think that that space that Foresight creates for the integration of different visions, perceptions, agendas or aims, it's something very important. No? It allows putting people together with different views, and it can help us find solutions that are better towards the common aim.
Great, Ignacio, thank you so much. Yeah, and this is another global challenges together with climate change, but of course not the only one. Clarissa, I must admit that as a molecular biologist, sometimes I'm concerned about the potential misuse of synthetic biology. This is a discipline that is growing so much during the last years. And I would like to know if you study this topic in your work, if you could develop a little bit more on how Foresight could inform the synthetic biology governance, especially in use of in the future.
Yes, so in our center, we have like a fascination for emerging technologies and the dual use of them. And one of the things that, for example, in the article that I was talking about, the future of bioengineering, we demonstrate is that the experts think that there are some topics related to synthetic biology as well. And some of them will be using synthetic biology to create new microbes in order to, for example, clean the rivers of polluted areas that are close by to mining companies, for example. And of course, this is a real good use of this type of technology, because at the moment you cannot do it with the microbes that we have at the moment at the extent that we will wish. But then you have the dual use that could be, can we use this type of technology to change microbes to do something different? Can we do it for creating a new human engineered pandemic, for example, and have such a catastrophic consequences as the ones that we have now? And to that, you can also add perhaps like the do-it-yourself biology movement, where from one side as well, they are doing great things, they are more democratizing science, but what happens when they enter in the realm of genetic engineering and they can do this type of experiments at home, and they are already doing it. And I think this is something that we also should be thinking about. Can we stop it? Probably not. So how do we do it in order to have them closer to us, to talk more with the government, to talk more with experts that have a little bit more of knowledge on the regulations, on the things that you are allowed to do and how to prevent leaks or prevent, catastrophic consequences. And I think Foresight, for example, for the bioengineering has worked very well. And I think that future scenarios is also a way that I'm using at the moment to communicate with citizens and with policymakers, and not really with academics that are already working on that. And one example of that was that we created a comic using 3 stories from that bioengineering article. And I'm going to put the link on the chat, but some of the 3 stories go around, for example, a person that has been giving away her genetic information in order to have personalized medicine. But then you have this same person having a problem with an health insurance company that doesn't want to provide a package because she has tendency to develop diabetes 3 or something like that, like whatever comes to your imagination. And then there is another story of using prosthetics or like neuronal probes that allow people that that cannot see to have now have a better vision. And then you have genes that now can charge your phone. And then you have like another story that goes around like, okay, but if we can use this for helping people, we can also use it to control it. Maybe we can access this type of neuronal probes, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just a way for me to try to introduce these new technologies to different stakeholders. And that's for me the beginning to start a conversation about risk and foresight and how we can bring them to our center and have expert elicitation with citizens, with the industry to talk about this type of issues.
Wow, that's so much interesting. Thank you, Clarissa. And well, now you have provided us with these ideas of what kind of work you do in your daily work. But I would like that you four share with us 1 or 2 outcomes or results of your foresight analysis that you are very proud of. And why? Please, Vanessa.
So when I was reflecting on this one, I was involved in discussions with respect to the current scenario framework that is used to think about a lot of the current climate change research. I had alluded to earlier in my comments how the way we decide to structure our energy systems, the way that we use land, and a variety of other decisions are contributors to the climate change problem. And so if we're thinking about or recognizing that the climate change we see now is the result of decisions that were made during the Industrial Revolution, if we're going to be talking about the rest of the 21st century, and then what does that mean for possible future levels of committed climate change, this is where you have to think about both socioeconomic changes over time, as well as what's happening in the physical climate system in response to those socioeconomic changes. And I was involved in informing how the latest framework was coming together. What exists in the current climate change scenario framework are, when talking about socioeconomic change, sort of these 5 large typologies of how the world, I guess, in general, what is it that is kind of like the socio-technical or socioeconomic direction and priorities of the globe? You know, do we continue what we've sort of done historically, where we're trying to maximize GDP growth, and we're doing that with dirtier technologies because they're the easiest energy technologies to use, or do we put in all of these investments to transfer to renewables and so forth? But there are also these questions about social relationships. What are the relationships between wealthy countries and developing countries and so forth? And when I was involved in this process, there were discussions about trying to have a simple scenario framework versus a more complex one. And one of the features that was not being considered at the time, but that my research did inform, was acknowledging that futures that perhaps are unequal, when I was involved, those kinds of futures were not explicitly being recognized as futures that were important to capture in the scenario framework for thinking about unfortunate futures that we may not necessarily want to have happen, but what would be the climate implications if they did? And so I, through using the particular approaches that I feel like are the best at trying to inform or trying to help us acknowledge either futures that are uncomfortable or futures that people sort of don't want to look at, I made a compelling case that futures of inequality should be included especially if a lot of the technological optimism behind things like, well, if we just figure out the emissions problem, then we don't have a climate change problem. But technology can be applied in unequal ways, where certain countries that have already benefited from technology continue to do so. Anyway, my point with this story is that through doing a good foresight analysis, one that was science-based, one that tries to make very transparent what are the assumptions behind these different scenarios, and also be very transparent about the systematic approach that one uses to exercise disciplined speculation. These unequal futures were adopted in the set of alternative socioeconomic futures. They're one of the 5. And I'm very proud of the fact that those uncomfortable futures, but futures that we have to understand what the implications of them would be if we were on a path where we were headed in that direction. How do we get off that path? And how can we communicate in the present things that we can avoid doing, so that way we don't have futures that we don't want?
Wow, yes. Again, with the social dimension, that's amazing. Thank you, Vanessa. And Marcus, what about you? Yeah, what do you feel especially proud of in your work?
Yeah, maybe recently I would maybe quote 2 examples. The one is the 2020 Strategic Foresight Report of the European Union, to which I contributed, which is a bit of a horizontal screening exercise. So it's really trying to identify what are possible futures for the European Union as such, in all policy areas. So it was done for the first time to such an extent. It was a huge exercise, but I think it was a worthwhile exercise to reflect also more generally about the future of a world region, essentially, and what different scenarios are there, and which one should we follow. The other example is a more specific one. It's the new generation of the Erasmus Plus program. So some of you might know, so it's a big mobility program of students, but also staff. And in conceptualizing the new generation of that program, which started at the beginning of this year, we also included a foresight perspective in the sense, what does COVID, but also digitalization mean for the future of physical mobility? I mean, a program that is essentially about people moving into other countries, into other cultures, in a situation where you cannot travel, where digitalization offers also alternatives. So how can we strike a balance between making best use of digitalization, but also being faced with a situation where even if you want to move to another country, you simply cannot because of travel restrictions and so on. So I think it was successful in the sense that a good balance was found in the end, that while the program stays focused on physical mobility, the experiences of the crisis and the pandemic, but also the fact that digitalization is progressing so quickly, has led now to a more hybrid program, where there are also a lot of digital elements that were not there before, or for people that they don't want to, or they cannot because they are handicapped, they cannot physically move to another country, are still offered possibilities to take part in the program. So this is maybe also example for sometimes a fairly practical added value of foresight when you can implement it directly in an existing piece of legislation.
Thank you, Marcus. And this report from Foresight of the European Union, when it was released?
So not too long. I will put the link in the chat, and then people can have a look at the report. So I will do that.
Thank you, Marcus. Great, thank you. What about our biodiversity guy, Ignacio?
Thank you, Felix. Yes, one of the things I enjoyed the most and I try to share is how we incorporated very different concepts. Think of, for example, on biodiversity, but also carbon or social equity that was mentioned before by Vanessa. So often different disciplines study these concepts separately, and it's hard to integrate them to assess how the future actions that we will do in our planet could impact those differently. So what we did is to create a future scenarios on how funds for forest conservation and forest restoration could be allocated to different countries, and what would be the outcomes in terms of biodiversity conservation, carbon sequestration, and social equity. What was interesting in this research is that not only that you integrate concepts from very different disciplines, so you need to have different expertise from different people, work with very different data, but also on the results that there is room for synergies, there is room for middle ground solutions that can be positive both for humans and for biodiversity and for the climate. And this type of interdisciplinary modeling, I think it's very much needed to respond to the challenges that we have with the SDGs, in which it's clear that we have different targets that we want to pursue, as many as them as fast as possible. And we need a Foresight Science that allow us to understand how we can, with the resources that we have, maximize the outcomes towards different SDGs, for example.
Thank you, Ignacio. And I would say that, Clarissa, you must have some product that you are very proud of. Could you share it with us, please?
Yeah, I think that the work I like and enjoy the most maybe is when we produce the report Foresight Science for Navigating Critical Transitions to the Leaders of the G20. And this was a massive international collaboration of most of national science academies around the world. And it was really great to find how we can reach consensus, how we can put in a report what are our ideas for the G20 leaders to focus on, which was circular economy, it was health, with technological development. And I think every time that I do a work related to foresight, I'm thinking like, how is this gonna reach to decision makers? And I think that this was a good example. I must be honest as well, and I have to say that I'm lacking the indicators to see how impactful was this report. And I think it's also really good for everyone or any practitioner to think about indicators. With foresight, sometimes it's difficult, but we have to try to do our best. And that could be quantification of how many times it was referenced. Did someone contacted you after that and follow up on the recommendations that you made and so on. And finally, what I like from this experience was something at a personal level, because part of the report says really clearly that the stories we tell to each other about the future have like the same weight as the stories that we tell to each other about our past. They have a lot of cultural baggage and importance. And I think that in the same way as we are used to say like, oh, you have to know your past so you don't repeat it, we also have to think about the future that we want and which things we have to do now in order to have this future or not the other one.
Great, Clarissa, thank you. Well, I remind the attendees in this activity that all you could write in the chat question to the panelists or comments. That's absolutely fine. Also to you panelists, if you are willing to share some of your products in the chat. Clarissa already shared one of her work, and also Marcus, Ignacio, and Vanessa. I invite you to also share some links to useful resources from your work, if you would like to, of course. Well, I have seen clearly that, for instance, between Ignacio and Vanessa, there are some, I don't know if overlapping, but I could identify some common interests or common values in your work. I don't know if I am right, but I would like that between you both, Vanessa and Ignacio, maybe you could formulate one question, and that question to be answered shortly, please, between you two.
Do you want to go ahead, Vanessa?
I know that what I've found very interesting, Ignacio, I think that it's really great to hear how in many respects, I guess that's IPBES is doing a better job than IPCC in terms of trying to like really do that on the ground work of getting people to think about their relationships to nature. So I guess I want to first congratulate you on the work that you're doing. But maybe I could also invite you to sort of comment on what it is that why is it that IPBES has like moved in this direction, in contrast to the climate change researchers? I guess that would be like maybe an interesting perspective that I'd like to hear from you with respect to like future studies and how it's been applied towards biodiversity, and kind of contrast it with how we see it being applied in the climate change context.
Yes, that's a great question. I think both processes, IPCC and IPBES, started more with scientists coming from a biophysical and ecological background. And possibly IPBES has navigated better the inclusion of social scientists or an interdisciplinary scientists, because ecosystem services and nature contributions to people are a central part in the framework. So there was a big effort to bring this kind of backgrounds to produce the reports and create new knowledge. And I think that has helped IPBES to move towards this nature futures framework that really tries to integrate human values, norms, and also institutions, formal institutions, to respond to see how these respond to the crisis that we face in terms of biodiversity loss and climate change. So yes, it's very exciting work, very challenging, but working on that. I also wanted to ask you on your work on inequality. And we know that climate change has first differentiated responsibilities in terms of historical responsibilities and differentiated impacts, right? Often the biggest impacts of climate change happen in poorer countries, which have less resources and less capacity to adapt. How can we deal with that? How can we incorporate less powerful voices that suffer climate change into climate change governance and climate change research?
Yeah, and I was acknowledging that I feel like I'm also still navigating this terrain myself. And sometimes it can be discouraging that I was just reading some news the other day looking at Canada just recently had an election. And it's a little too early to say exactly what's going to happen on the Canadian side, but I was reading some analysis about the climate summit that's happening or has just been happening that President Biden has hosted. And how on the one hand, there's a lot of effort being made by people who are in positions in power and do understand how serious the climate crisis is. But when you have a country like the United States that is so decentralized that President Biden can have one agenda, but then there are other very powerful people in Congress that can completely torpedo whatever it is that the president is doing because they have political interests, that they're trying to protect. That's something that I found very frustrating working in the climate change space is how do we get people to sort of line up the different incentives that are sort of directing them and directing their choices. And I guess something that we have in common, Ignacio, since you mentioned that a lot of the research that you're doing has been looking at things like allocation of financial resources. Maybe that's a bit of a glimmer of hope, seeing that, and when Marcus was mentioning that in the EU, there's becoming more and more a norm to appreciating foresight as a particular skill set and also as a very much needed way of trying to make decisions in the present, that we have to be taking into account the future. I suppose it's great to hear that there's sort of been a move amongst central banks and whatnot to try to disclose things like climate risk and exposures that different banks and different investment companies have. It's not entirely mainstream yet, but it's been very encouraging to hear opinion leaders who focus on finance to say that we actually need to be more explicit now about understanding the relationships between these monetary streams, these institutions that are controlling and directing a lot of the funds, and what is their relationship to different energy companies and different technologies that are privileged versus not. So I guess this is a bit of a roundabout answer to your question, Ignacio, that if we can get some of those like very powerful interests already acknowledging how the climate crisis affects them and how like they are playing a role in the crisis and exacerbating the crisis, but they could do differently, right? They could instead identify how can they actually help alleviate the crisis instead. Hopefully this will in turn also help to improve equity issues as well.
Well, it has been great to witness this exchange between you both. Thank you. Well, we are reaching the final of the event, but before, I would like to know what do you think about the future of foresight? What about the foresight of foresight? Are there emerging practices to keep on the radar? How do you see the field on, I don't know, 20, 30, 15 years? Marcus, could you develop in this, please?
So that makes things even more complicated to think about something which by definition is already about uncertainty. But no, jokes aside, I think there is indeed what we heard also today, a certain momentum for strategic foresight. I would start with that. I mean, I quoted the EU example that, consciously applying foresight, and we see it also in other parts of the world, that it's maybe used more actively and more consciously than in the past, so, which is good news. I think what will certainly play an important role for the future is the increasing importance of artificial intelligence. So I'm quite convinced, so big data will play maybe an even more important role, which has maybe more chances than risks, but we shouldn't forget about the risks. And so they lay on the one hand, again, big data, but also maybe more generally where I see a bit of a problem for foresight is in the context of growing skepticism vis-a-vis expert cultures in general, in times of fake news, when you even try to challenge really evidence that we have in the present, it's an even easier target to project the future. If someone really wants, they will always find an argument why this is not really to be trusted and so on. And I think this makes maybe foresight a challenge still for us. How do you deal with it when there is growing skepticism towards experts in general, when talking about experts that try to project the future which is uncertain? So maybe that's where I see both risks and challenges ahead for foresight.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Marcus. Clarissa, what's your point of view on this question? How do you see the future of foresight?
I think that the future is going to be very limited if foresight is going to be done in majority just by practitioners in the global north. I think that we need more capacity building in order to include voices coming from the global south. And as Vanessa mentioned before, the field of futuristic and the future of the world needs more voices coming from let's say from indigenous communities coming from Peru, or what they have to say in Thailand about how they see the future, what are for them really global catastrophic risks, or we all have different priorities. So while here perhaps we focus more on AI and alignment or superintelligence, reaching the level of superintelligence with AI, perhaps in the Pacific Islands, they are more concerned about the consequences of global catastrophic risk in terms of climate change and the waters rising. So I think we need that. We need, if for a truly global, product, you really need to bring the voices from all the different parts. And an example like this, like that you said, let's do this webinar, let's talk about foresight and let's talk about examples. It's a good initiative that should be replicated in Japanese, in Spanish, in French, and whatever language it takes to bring it to all the corners of the planet. So Foresight can really have a good future.
That's great, Clarissa. It seems very fair. Thank you. Vanessa, would you add something more about the future of Foresight?
Yeah, so one of the things that, since I mentioned, that the world is a complex place, there's a really interesting group of people that focus on what they call deep uncertainty. So they refer to problems, maybe other people have heard the phrase wicked problem. Deeply uncertain problems and wicked problems have some things that are in common, namely that there's enough sort of inherent scientific uncertainty and complexity in the system that we already just don't fully understand what's going on. But then people also have disagreements. This is where I mentioned values in my opening remarks. They have disagreements about, even if we can come up with a set of plausible futures, people will disagree about which futures are actually the preferred ones. And they'll also disagree on, whether outcomes are good or bad. So it's sort of like, lots and lots of disagreement. But people who, there's sort of, this relatively new professional society, they call themselves the Society for Decision-Making Under Deep Uncertainty. They advocate that we should be trying to find robust policy solutions. So solutions that minimize regret across this, very heterogeneous set of very different values and very different understandings of what's going on. And these people use computational tools in order to try to identify what are these low regret, no regret policy options. So this idea of human-computer interaction, I do agree with how some folks are bringing up, artificial intelligence, both understanding the social impacts of AI just on how we interact with each other. Maybe there are some scientists in the room where they use AI in their work. And so AI is also just sort of changing the way that we do science. But the human element is also very interesting. How do the humans interact with the AI? So I think looking at human-computer interaction as we become more and more as we lean on computation more and more to help us keep track of all the data and make sense of all the data, I think that's an interesting space to watch for the future of future studies.
Yeah. Thank you, Vanessa. And well, Ignacio, what about your point of view on the future? The future of the future?
I agree there is a bright future for Foresight.
Yeah.
Many scientific disciplines are incorporating it more and more. For example, conservation biology and social ecological system science with participatory scenarios, just to name an example, because we have learned the value of this approach and this methodology. So I fully agree with what Marcus said before. I think one of the challenges now is how do we move from Foresight Science that predicts some things that are going to happen, like climate change disasters, biodiversity loss, rising temperatures, and these things. How do we move from that to real action to solve some of those challenges? No, and I think that working with different stakeholder typologies, as the local and indigenous communities, as Clarissa mentioned, and also governments at different scales in the creation of these scenarios and solutions to different challenges is going to be a key component, so that it's not scientists speaking the science to society, but it's the co-production of knowledge with different stakeholder typologies that provide the best evidence that we have towards the future and identify different solutions that could be put in practice to respond to those challenges. So I would like to call again for these spaces of discussion that Foresight can create to bring together different stakeholders, and at the end, Foresight should help create a better world.
Yeah, hopefully. Okay, before closing the activity, I have a question in the chat. I will formulate it, and I would like that some of you volunteer to provide answer. It is most often the decisions being taken by policymakers and politicians are motivated by immediate economic and social benefits, which is in contradiction to sustainability. How do we incorporate foresight intelligence to overrule short-term local benefits for long-term global benefits?
If you allow me, Felix.
Of course.
Yeah, I think that there are two things. One could be you create a law that ensures this. And with that, I would like to bring up the example of what's happening in the UK at the moment. So there is the bill for future generations being discussed in the parliament. And this bill, it's very focused on thinking about the future. And they are proposing different kind of things that involve not just the offices in the government, which will be, for example, to create future officer or have more institutions that are doing foresight and horizon scanning. They also go outside and they also talk how they are going to monitor companies and how they are going to propose that perhaps companies have committees to think about how the impact of their decisions is going to be seen on future generations in 15, 25 years. So that will be one way. And the other way that we can, I guess, do is to, in our level, is to talk more, to have it as a dinner conversations, to talk about what is foresight to our colleagues, to our friends, to our relatives, to think if we will have done more foresight, will the pandemic with COVID-19 would have been different? Is the problem of foresight, or is a problem of miscommunication, or is a political problem, right? And it's politicians the ones that were not listening to scientists since many years ago in the same way that is happening with climate change. So I think like we can try to act at both levels, at the very high level and the grassroots level.
Yeah, thank you for your answer, Clarissa. And well, I have a very last question for all of you. I will ask you to try to respond it shortly because we are running on time. And well, what would you say to the audience, to our attendees, that mainly, they are mainly science students, about the discipline, how to be engaged in foresight, how to cultivate or nurture the future-minded thinking in the people that is not engaged with this discipline. Please provide us with some concrete recommendation. Go ahead, Clarissa.
Yeah, I think that we can talk about what happened at the Global Young Academy, right? So yes. Someone bring up the topic and then you have the other person that motivates and moves everyone around to say like, okay, let's call someone to receive training on foresight. And that's what Felix did. He went and talked with Policy Horizons in Canada, which is an institution from the government there that is focused on foresight, to bring and train the Global Young Academy members that were interested on the topic. So that could be like one step, like think about your organization and at that level and what things you can do. If you have a friend that is working on this, invite him or her to have a presentation for your group. Or then you can try to think in my local government, do we have this type of offices? Do we have something that is working on future scenarios or horizon scan? How can I be part of it? For example, here in the UK, you have the Post Office, which is Science and Technology Office, and they have a subdivision that is focused on that. And sometimes they have open calls where they are expecting that experts come, sign up, and then they are part of their studies. And then we did one last year, which was about what are the topics that the government should be focused for managing COVID-19. So I think it comes with a lot of motivation from ourselves and not expect that someone knocks at our door and say like, hey, there is a course for foresight here.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Clarissa. Marcus?
Yeah, I would follow up directly on what Clarissa said, in the sense of obviously seize opportunities when they emerge, both in the sense when there are training opportunities, but also as we discussed today, I mean, there is a bit of a trend to see more foresight at different levels in different institutions. So seize that opportunity. But maybe more importantly than anything else is be ready also to be open to think a little bit outside of the box. What do I mean? You know, as scientists, we are often used to, oh, we shouldn't speculate too much about the future. Let's rely only on the hard facts, you know, and everything that is becoming too uncertain, we shouldn't deal with. So be open to do that as well, and consider it as really an enriching complement to classical or traditional scientific work. And I think with that mindset, I think, you know, you're already put on the right track, and you will be able to seize emerging opportunities. So that would be maybe my take-home message for participants today.
Thank you, Marcus. Vanessa, could you continue, please?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that's been said so far, and I think that if you are a scientist or you become a scientist who's interested in that interface between science, technology, and society, maybe scenarios will fall in your lap, because it is sort of inevitable that you will encounter some futures thinking if you are working in that space. But then that's where, I guess, following from what Clarissa and Marcus said, lean into it. Right. So I know for myself, in terms of how I became more informed about future studies, you know, I read review papers. I tried to understand what are all the different methodologies that people are using, what were the different methodologies that I was seeing, because it's a really vast space, people who are working on futures thinking. So there's a lot to learn.
Thank you. And finally, you, Ignacio.
Thanks. Yeah, I would just add that sometimes foresight, if you look at it from outside, it could look complex, right? So many variables, future tendencies, complex models. But the good thing of it is so flexible that you could apply it from very different approaches. You could apply spatial modeling or participatory planning of future scenarios or visioning exercises. So there is such a diverse set of methodologies and approaches to apply foresight that I think everybody can find its own space within it. And I think that's one of the very cool things of it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, we have reached the end of the activity. I will share in the chat now the Instagram account of Jacopo, the illustrator that has been with us during this activity, for you all to follow his work and be attentive to his activity and to have his contact. If this is the moment for any question from the audience, please feel free to open your microphone or to provide your question. Thank you, Vanessa. Or to provide your questions in the chat. There you have in the chat the link to the Jacopo's Instagram file account. Well, and I think that what has been clear today is that this foresight exercise can provide strategically useful information for action. And this is important. This is important for the sound and good governance of diverse disciplines around the globe, especially for addressing global challenges. So thank you very much to the panelists, to the scientific illustrator, and especially to the attendees. We were over 30 attendees, so great. Thank you so much to all of you for having attended the activity. You can find the contact of the panelists on internet. They are, so you could put their names on Google and you will find a lot of information that they have produced during the last years on this regard. So again, thank you all, the panelists and the attendees, for having been met today. And I hope that the seed of the foresight is already in the attendees, and this would lead to a very good and interesting activities in the future. So I will stop the recording, and thank you so much, and have a good and nice rest of the day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Felix.
Yeah, thanks, Felix.
Thank you. Goodbye.